In this lesson, we learn about fermentation. During fermentation, cells convert NADH to NAD plus by passing high energy electrons back to pyruvic acids. This action actually converts the NADH back into the electron carrier NAD plus, allowing glycolysis to produce a steady supply of ATP. So, where do we see ATP in this illustration? Well, if you said right there, you would be correct because that's where it is. No denying it. All right, so fermentation is basically an anaerobic process that occurs in the cytoplasm of a cell. Anaerobic means without oxygen, so no oxygen present. And sometimes glycolysis, which if you recall is the first step of cellular respiration, glycolysis and fermentation are together referred to as anaerobic respiration. That's what we're going to be looking at today. So, what's missing from this particular illustration of fermentation that was involved in the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain? Well, tell me if you can find anywhere on this screen oxygen. Just straight up good old-fashioned oxygen. You don't find any because fermentation, again, is a process that occurs in the absence of oxygen. Okay? So, fermentation is referred to as an anaerobic respiration for that very reason. It takes place without any oxygen. So, here we see two different pathways of fermentation. One is the alcoholic fermentation pathway, and we see that on the left side of the screen here. And it also produces NAD plus from NADH. And then we have the lactic acid fermentation pathway. Now, the lactic acid fermentation pathway is very similar to the alcoholic fermentation pathway, except that we don't produce any carbon dioxide in a lactic acid fermentation, but in alcoholic fermentation, we do produce carbon dioxide. We also produce 2 ethyl alcohols. If you take a look at the ethyl alcohols here, we get 2 of them from alcoholic fermentation. But back on the lactic acid side, what we get instead of ethyl alcohols, we get 2 lactic acid molecules. So even though our illustration that we have here actually shows both alcoholic and lactic acid, don't get it twisted. These 2 different pathways typically do not happen at the same time or in the presence of one another. Okay. Most organisms are either going to carry out one or the other. Okay. So the figure shows us that pyruvic acid from glycolysis entering either alcoholic or lactic acid fermentation, but it doesn't do both. It's going to go one way or the other. Okay, and you see the pyruvic acids right here. So they're either going to go to this side or to this side, to the alcoholic fermentation or to the lactic acid fermentation. Never do they split between the two. It's just we don't see that in nature. Okay, organisms either produce alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. And of course, they're named after the molecules that they end up producing. In this case, ethyl alcohol. In this case, lactic acids. All right, so let's take a look a little deeper at the alcoholic fermentation portion of glycolysis. Okay, and then as you can see up here, we've got a bit of a equation like we've had for photosynthesis and for cellular respiration. We also have a formula for alcoholic fermentation, and that's where pyruvic acid and NADH will react with one another to produce an alcohol and some carbon dioxide, as we see here, and of course NAD+. So if we were to fill that in, it would look like this. So this is the alcoholic fermentation equation, chemical equation, okay? In summary. Okay, now alcoholic fermentation is important to us because that's what causes bread dough to rise, and it's also what's used to produce alcoholic beverages. So our case study, which is about the San Francisco sourdough case study, obviously alcoholic fermentation is involved in that in order to produce the sourdough bread that we've been talking about in our case study. Okay, so basically, when the yeast cells that are in that dough run out of oxygen, the dough will actually begin to ferment. It'll start going through this process. And in the process, it gives off those tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide, these little buggers right here, right? And they basically produce these little air spaces in the bread that you can see when you cut it open, okay? Now, a small amount of alcohol is also produced in the dough, but it basically evaporates as the bread is being baked. So that's why you don't get drunk from drinking or from eating bread. Okay, so now let's take a look at the lactic acid portion of fermentation. Okay, so basically we have another equation here that we can complete for lactic acid fermentation, and that is almost the same as alcoholic fermentation. It's a little bit different, but almost the same. We take pyruvic acids and NADHs. They react with one another, just like in alcoholic fermentation, but the products are going to be different. So the products in this case are going to be, oops, I went too far, are going to be, there we go, lactic acid and NAD+. Okay, so we get NAD+ from the alcoholic fermentation too, but we get the lactic acid instead of the ethyl alcohols. All right, so which form of fermentation do you think is carried out by your body? Well, if you're thinking the lactic acid fermentation, then you would be correct. We are considered lactic acid fermenters. All right, so again, we are considered lactic acid fermenters, and during brief periods without oxygen, a lot of the cells in our bodies are actually capable of producing ATP through this lactic acid fermentation process. So the cells that are best adapted to doing that are going to be our muscle cells, mainly, because they need a large supply of ATP for those rapid bursts of activity. In this picture here, you see swimmers, and they're swimming and they're not breathing as often as you would be if you were running. But what do you think the effects are of having lactic acid building up in an athlete's muscles? Well, if you recall at the beginning of this chapter, we had a discussion question that asked you how you feel when you run for a long period of time. And I know that a number of you mentioned that you either get cramps or like in your side stitches. Sometimes they were called when I was growing up. We called them stitches, um, or side cramps. Also, muscles begin to cramp or get sore or like start to burn. Right? You hear that phrase, "Feel the burn," right? Well, that is the result of lactic acid being built up in your muscles. Now, it might not be that you're not breathing. It may just be that you're using more energy than normal cellular respiration can produce. So it doesn't have all the oxygen that it needs, or you can't get enough oxygen fast enough to produce ATP. So your body will switch to the lactic acid fermentation, and then once there's oxygen, it'll switch back to doing the oxygen, and it'll keep going back and forth like that. But in the process of doing the lactic acid fermentation, those lactic acids are going to actually start to build up. They don't get reused like in cellular respiration, where pretty much everything gets reused over and over again. Lactic acid doesn't. So it builds up in your muscles, and it creates that sensation of burning or soreness in your muscles. Now, up until recently, a lot of people thought that lactic acid buildup was responsible for muscle fatigue and soreness, but researchers have actually found out that lactic acid can actually be used as a fuel by mitochondria to make energy. So at the beginning of a short distance swim race, what do you think the principal source of energy is for the swimmer's muscles? Well, it's usually the ATP that's already stored up in the cells, and then ATP gets produced by lactic acid rather than ATP that's produced by lactic acid. It's mostly already made, already kind of sitting there waiting to get used. Now, cellular respiration releases energy a little more slowly than fermentation does. Fermentation can occur pretty quickly. It doesn't have as many reactions that it has to go through. So the human body actually stores energy in the muscles and other tissues, and they do that in the form of carbohydrate glycogen. And these stores of glycogen are usually enough to last for like 15 to 20 minutes of activity. After that, your body starts to break down other stored molecules, including fats, for energy. And so what form of exercise would be most beneficial for weight control? Well, if you're thinking aerobic forms of exercise, things like running, dancing, biking, swimming, if you're thinking of those sorts of exercises, you would be right. Those types of exercise are most beneficial for weight control.